Susan Wojcicki was an amazing person, and her life was cut tragically short when she died last August after a 2-year battle with non small cell lung cancer. She was just 56 years old. She was an incredible trailblazer in the tech world, helping to build and lead both Google and YouTube, where she served as CEO from 2014 until stepping down in 2023. She was also a beloved wife, mom of 5, and the eldest of the amazing Wojcicki sisters, whose extraordinary successes even inspired their mom, Esther, to write a book about raising successful kids, and the CEO of 23andMe. And Janet, professor of pediatrics at UC San Francisco, are here to talk a little bit about their big sister. Thank you both for spending some time with me. Obviously, I didn't know Susan nearly as well as you two, but I admired her deeply and was always so impressed with her kindness and intelligence and equanimity. She was always seemed so calm, and she was just a calming presence to be with. So you were her little sisters. Janet, what was it like growing up with Susan?
It's interesting that you use the word kind of calmness and equanimity. As her sister, we had that feeling. Of course, you have your parents, right, that are looking after you. But when you had a sister like Susan, I mean, we were only 18 months apart, just one school grade. But I still had a sense, like a very, protected and secure sense. I mean, we were always in the same schools. We did a lot of the same activities. She was just always kind, I mean, there was always a good ethical compass, I would say. And so, as the younger of, we were almost treated as twins. I just felt, I never questioned her motives really. And I think that's unusual with siblings, particularly that are so close in age.
And did you look up to your sister, Susan? Did you want to emulate her in some ways? A little sister looks up to an older sister.
Yeah, definitely. Susan was the big sister. Um, Obviously in a dynamic of three, you can get, some that get excluded or some that fight more. I would say Jana and I were definitely the ones to pick on each other, and Susan was the adult in the room, and Susan was always there. Yes, Susan was always there to sort of, like, she would play with me. She would come up with arts and crafts. She was very responsible. I could always rely on her to follow up or to defend me if I got in trouble. So Susan was very much of that big sister, and also somewhat of the peacekeeper.
In fact, your mom, Esther, said that Susan was the most level-headed of the three of you and that she was born being rational. Does that ring true to you, Janet?
So, and it's interesting, I actually see it a lot in her kids as well. She has a 9-year-old, and she has 3 daughters, and they're all just amazing, and they've inherited that ability from her. Sadly, Anne and I are not. I don't know if it's a recessive trait.
Speak for yourself.
Anne, are you not very rational or level-headed,
No.
Anne?
I think that Janet and Susan, like I said, Susan was the leader of the tribe. And Janet and I, because Susan would often
You're a leader in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, Susan would take the fall, for instance, if we got in trouble, if there was something. And so she was always she is definitely the most level-headed. I think Janet and I had a higher risk tolerance, and we were, when I think on our careers and areas where we wanted to, push boundaries more, we were more willing to take on risk.
How competitive were you three? And did that sometimes get out of hand, Janet? Because three hugely successful, smart, ambitious girls in one household, that things can get sort of tricky at times, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Susan, again, I mean, I think there was at one point in childhood where I basically wanted to skip a grade into Susan's grade. And I think that was a little bit, that was the cutting line. That was a little bit too much. I remember she actually went to Harvard, for undergrad, but she got into Stanford as well. And I was just 1 year behind her. And I remember her saying to me, when she was making the decision, Janet, if I go to Stanford, would you agree to go too? Like, so we could all kind of, stay at home kind of thing. So it wasn't really about the competition and, oh, I'm going to go off and maybe go to the number one school or whatever. It was like, well, maybe I should like make a deal and we should actually stay together. So I thought
that ended up not happening though, right?
I know. Yeah.
Susan went to Harvard, you went to Stanford. I guess in a way that must have been sort of healthy for the two of you.
It was a little bit, but I always felt that it was kind of it was her character in a way to kind of like check in with me beforehand, right? And, thinking about people first, and not necessarily, motives or, or outcomes. I mean, positive outcomes for both. I guess she was trying to really think of us as a family, as siblings.
So much has been written and discussed about the extraordinary Wojcicki sisters, as you all know, and your incredible career trajectories. What did your parents feed you three that made you all so successful? When you think about how you were raised, and I know your mom wrote a whole book about this, but Anne, what do you think the secret sauce was?
I think there's a couple elements. I think that, I think one of the main things, my mom will talk about independence, which we definitely had a lot of independence. And I think my mom did always have that. She always treated us like we had a real voice. Even when I was little, I was given that authority to argue with her or both my parents and to, negotiate ideas. And, I never felt like I had rules. Like there was never, a top-down approach of like, you must follow X, Y, or Z. There was always
I said so.
Right. It was never I said so. I remember being very bewildered as a child once where a friend said like, oh, well, my parents just said that. I'm like, well, can't you negotiate? And they're like, no, that doesn't work. And like the way we were raised, like there was always the ability to negotiate. And I think that we did grow up in a family that was very academic, that appreciated debate. And my mom and my dad always looked at like the world is meant to change. So you should envision the future. And then you fight for that, like you advocate. And so I remember my mom, for instance, in very simple terms, there was empty land behind her house. And she's like, well, we should build a playground. And then she lobbied the city and she got money and she built a playground. Like in the simplest terms, my mom was always a very action-oriented person. And she demonstrated to us over and over again that when you see something, when you have an idea, you can make it happen. The other thing I always point out, though, is, there's always that talk of to raise a family, it does take a village. And I'm very grateful to the entire community that we grew up with, because it wasn't just our family. It was, my best friend's family, but was also close with Susan and with Janet and all those parents. And we happened to grow up in a community that really supported that kind of academic thought, that pushed boundaries. And all of us were given a fair amount of trust and independence.
Janet, I also should mention you all grew up on the campus of Stanford where your dad, Stanley, was a physics professor. So there's a lot of nature here, isn't there, Janet?
Yeah, it's interesting though, both of my dad's parents, his father was a judge, actually in pre-war Polish government. And then, actually was in exile in London during the war. And so when you asked a little bit about Susan, I think about Susan's moral compass, and even Anne's, the ethics, the commitment to, social justice. I think growing up, there was nothing more honorable and nothing that could, trump actually doing good in the world, right? And making a difference for people, whether it be through science or art or, law. It just was something that would actually improve the world, was actually the best possible thing that you could do as a human being.
you three also grew up at a time where a lot of girls were not necessarily gravitating towards science and technology. And all three of you, I think, were extremely interested in those areas. And in fact, Mattel made Barbie dolls of the three of you to encourage girls to go into STEM, which is so
I'm
great. That must have been so fun and made your, oh, and you have kind of a Janet, Barbie
I'm wearing my
Janet.
Barbie shirt,
Yeah,
right? It's always like hidden.
that must have made your parents so happy.
I think our parents, you know, like I said, my dad used to tell me all the time, the most important thing is you find something that you love doing every day. And whatever you do, you want to love it and you want to be passionate about it. And I think echoing what Janet said, it was also about that moral imperative and doing, you know, doing something that is actually beneficial for the world. So I think that my parents, they never set a limitation for us. Like there was never a sense of like, oh, you couldn't go into physics or you couldn't go into math, you couldn't go into some area. And don't forget, we were exposed to physics and hard science all the time. So my dad being a particle physicist, we were surrounded, like we were at particle physics meetings, like we were always discussing neutrinos and, you know, like other, like involved in big physics projects. My best friend's mother also was a professor at Stanford in immunology. And so I also had that, Shoshana Levy, I had that as a role model of like, oh, of course, like you can do anything. And I think the best thing our parents did is they, you know, my dad was obviously hard science and my mother was an educator. They kind of, you know, we ran the gamut of science and literature and art, and it was all possible and it was all good. Just love whatever you do.
Tell us about Susan's passion for her career and her trajectory, because she went from Intel, right, to Google, then to YouTube. Tell us about what drove her professionally, Janet.
You know, it's interesting because Susan was always the creative one. I mean, among the three of us, in terms of like doing crafts at home and drawing and cooking. And then she was a history and literature major at Harvard, you know, and worked on the Crimson and always had that, you know, interest in kind of the creative side of activities and you know, even professionally, like the idea of thinking what she could do creatively. And I think that just, you know, on a whim, she took a computer science course. I think it was her last year at Harvard, and realized actually then, you know, was doing kind of, we just happened to grow up and right be in the heart of Silicon Valley. So took on over the summers and holidays, kind of these temporary jobs just to kind of fill in and earn a little bit of money. And, you know, after taking the computer science course at Harvard and having these kind of short-term experiences, I think at some kind of burgeoning computer companies realize actually tech, you know, is actually very creative. So I think that kind of wasn't what she was expecting, blew her mind a little bit. And, you know, then had the good fortune of just actually running and meeting people like Larry and Sergey, and, you know, thinking that actually this is something that I want to be a part of and be involved in. And ultimately, YouTube, you know, was just the best possible world in terms of being technology, but actually being able to foster the creativity and development of all these creators. So I think that was just the epitome of her, you know, of her career and her, you know, her deep, real setted interests, who she was as a person.
And tell us what kind of leader Susan was and how you witnessed her in action, because it strikes me she cared deeply, deeply about the people who worked for her.
I think she definitely cared deeply about the people that worked for her. You know, I think the thing that I learned from Susan, she was very clear and decisive. I think she was very fair. She really liked structure. I think that was one of the things that when you speak to a lot of the artists and the creators, they appreciated the structure that Susan brought to it, that Susan created a platform that really ran based on systems and rules. And I think that within the company, I think people felt like she was very fair, that she listened to people, and she was decisive. I think she was really an extraordinary leader, and I think also she was very warm, like she was very empathetic and could relate when people, for a lot of new moms, for a lot of people who had family issues. I think she cared. And I think it was kind of that combination of being very clear, very directive, and caring about people that made so many people, I think, really appreciate her and feel like that she really impacted their careers and helped them grow.
And she was running YouTube at the same time she was raising not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 kids.
Mm-hmm. Structure.
How did she do that?
All about the structure.
She actually said at one point, that because after she was, her 5th child was actually quite a bit later after the first 4. And she kept coming and saying, I want to have 5. I want to have 5. And I was like, you crazy? Really? Aren't you satisfied with 4? But she said, the things that made her such a good manager at YouTube and able to actually work well, with people actually functioned in the same way in the home environment. Right. I mean, she said to me at one point, right, I can manage my house, my kids, there are parallels between what I do at home and what I do at work. So I always thought that was interesting.
She was diagnosed with non-small cell lung cancer at the end of 2022. She had virtually no symptoms. She was running several miles a day. And this must have come, needless to say, as a tremendous shock. I remember when I learned my older sister, Emily, had pancreatic cancer, and I honestly had a hard time processing, especially since I had just lost my husband. So tell me about that period of time, Janet and Anne, when you learned about Susan's diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was, there were months, even now, 2 years out, I'm still kind of in a state of shock, right? That this happened, because she didn't have any of there's a growing incidence of non-small cell lung in particularly women who were never smokers. But she didn't have any of the traditional risk factors that you look for when you look for lung cancer. And unfortunately, we don't have, in the United States and most of the rest of the world, good screening modalities to find early stage lung cancers. We just, we don't recommend in the US these low dose CTs for never smokers. So by the time she was diagnosed, it was already advanced, and she, had minimal symptoms. She thought she had just pulled a muscle in her leg, and ended up being a bone metastases. So, we were all very, I think, just horrified and shocked, and just trying to look for answers. Most people with terminal disease, right, are trying to understand why me, and why now, and what why did this happen? So I think that we are still searching, and that's, we have a larger vision of trying to actually turn the needle on lung cancer prevention and funding. We're still in shock, and we're still searching for answers. And I think until the end, Susan was also, right, searching for answers and in shock of it.
And I imagine that among the 3 of you, you were laser focused on finding out about the best treatments. As Janet said, the diagnostic tools just weren't there. But when you discovered, or Susan discovered, that the cancer had metastasized, I'm sure you were investigating clinical trials all over the world and different therapeutic options. Talk about that journey, Anne, and what was out there that could have helped Susan or that didn't help Susan?
Yeah. I, the week that she was diagnosed, as Janet said, was a total surprise. And, we were really hoping that it was not lung cancer, but it was something else, because in part, I think all of us knew that lung cancer is not treatable, but other cancers can be, or is not curable, I should say. So once we found out it was lung cancer, it really became that deep dive into who do we know and how are we going to help her. And I took off a week from work and I called 60 people that I know, just people that I know or people that I think could help. And I just started calling everyone. And it was remarkable. I think that healthcare is often vilified in all these different ways. You look at all the different ways where people complain about big pharma, but ultimately people go into healthcare because they all had their own family tragedy and they all want to make a difference. And it was remarkable, like the outreach and the people willing to help or give a suggestion or point me in a direction was amazing. And I think the way Janet, Susan, and I ran it, it was really, it was like Susan became the CEO of her cancer. And we had a list. Susan always liked to know, okay, what are all the different options? Like what's, step 1, step 2, step 3, that you're going to fail a treatment at some point and what are going to be all of those options. And I would tell her all the time, amazing cures. Like it's really just about staying alive as long as you can, because there's amazing cures that are coming and cancers that you could not treat 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And I would talk about Jimmy Carter, like, cancers like melanoma, these people are alive, like, and it's amazing. Like Jimmy Carter's, it's an amazing story. So I do think for cancer patients, you have to keep that optimism. You have to keep believing because you have these extraordinary stories. And that is frankly why you keep going. So we looked at a lot at the cellular therapies that are out there. There were some amazing clinical trials, and there's a couple companies that I'm very grateful for about how they went above and beyond to try and help us. I do think the more you can make personal connections with investigators or your physicians and express that interest. And, Jan and I really stayed on top of it. Like we did whatever we could to help the clinical team keep track of Susan, keep track of what was going on, so that we could make sure that she was getting the best care possible. And I think ultimately, Susan looked to us and was like, we need to figure out a cure for this. And I think Jan and I were always realistic about what a almost impossible task that is. But I think that we both now are really motivated about, the fact that there should be screening. There absolutely should be some way that you can screen for cancer besides having a chest CT, and that we need to have better treatment mechanisms.
Tell me about the blog post that you all published posthumously that Susan had written and why you thought that was important, Janet.
Yeah, so Susan initially hadn't been public with her diagnosis. I think just in part, right, it's like related to this kind of why me type thing that you're kind of, you're inundated initially with you're like trying to make sense personally of your diagnosis.
And then of course you've got your family and your children.
Yes, right. All those people, kind of the circles surrounding you. And because she's a public person or was a public person, right, she was just unable at the time to communicate that because she hadn't really made sense of it herself. But, going into the diagnosis, or after a year and a half, she really realized that there were so many holes in the prevention and treatment of lung cancer, and that she as a public person could make a difference in that journey. And so she felt very committed to actually doing something, and was working with her team at YouTube to actually draft something and publish a blog, and kind of trying to think of the best way to publicize this information and get the urgency out. And, unfortunately, she was working on that when she passed away. She passed away, quicker than, of course, we would have hoped. even predating her own diagnosis, she had been, funneling quite a large amount of money and effort into cancer research in general. She was actually even funding some Stanford associated lung cancer research before her diagnosis. And so she was committed in this area before, but then, kind of ramped it up for sure when she was diagnosed and wanted to, put herself out there as a public figure to, spread the word that this is underfunded, that there isn't good prevention, and there's a huge amount of stigma. When I think, why is it that lung cancer, there's more deaths in the United States, women and men, from lung cancer
Number one cancer killer.
Yes, from breast, colon, and prostate combined. And yet we completely underfund it. And I mean, the only thing I can think of is just that, we haven't really advanced, we haven't accepted as a public, in the way we should, all of the advances in addiction science, right? So we're still blaming, the people with lung cancer, for having a disease, right? When the science has been telling us now for many years that addiction is a disease and we can't blame people. We can't blame people for having lungs. And ultimately that is, the main reason why, or the only reason why people are getting lung cancer.
And in fact, 20% of people who get lung cancer are like Susan. They never smoked.
Right.
But you're right. This stigma seems to exist that, blaming the patient and suggesting somehow they brought this on themselves. And that must have been frustrating for you.
Well, it's one of the things I think Jan and I hope to change is that I do think, the first question everyone always asks us when we say Susan died of lung cancer is, did she smoke? And it's a very reasonable question, but I do think that stigma is really there. And I agree with Jana in terms of the addiction science, the importance of being able to move beyond that and recognize lung cancer is a major health crisis. It's the number one killer. It's underfunded compared to all the other cancers. And I think it's important to emphasize to everybody what you just said is that you don't have to be a smoker to get lung cancer. So there is a rising number of people who are getting lung cancer who were never smokers. And I think it's important to destigmatize it. I think it's important to bring that awareness. And I think it's really critical to have a diagnostic or a screening mechanism to screen, because like other cancers, if you can find this at stage 1, it is highly treatable and curable, but you have to find it at stage 1. And that's where Jan and I both are also passionate for people who do qualify for current screening. So people who were heavier smokers, who are over 50, they do qualify under the U.S. Prevention Task Force guidelines to get access to a low-dose CT scan, and they should get one. Only 5% of those people who qualify are now getting them. So we definitely are advocates for the screening, that there has to be other ways that you can have a broad screening mechanism that will screen everybody, and people who currently qualify should definitely be going and getting it.
I think we all want to turn tragedies like this into something positive, especially when there are people like you who are, so smart and know a lot of people, have access to a lot of medical experts and companies that can help spread the word. I mean, you all, I think, are the perfect people to move the needle because of all those things I mentioned. What are your ultimate goals? What do you hope to accomplish in the wake of your sister's death?
I think that there's a couple aspects of Susan that I think are really important, that I think what we want to honor. So first and foremost, I think that there's absolutely this incredible opportunity for us to drive awareness in lung cancer. And I think if you look at Susan as an incredible CEO with all of these opportunities and privileges and her 5 children and this amazing life, and that she got lung cancer, like it makes people realize like it could happen to anybody. And I think it's you know, if I look in 10 years time, I want to see a screening mechanism applicable to everybody that is going to prevent this from happening. So I think that is number one. I think number two, if you read Susan's blog post, she talks about the appreciation of every day.
In fact, can I
And
read that, Anne? I have it
yeah,
in front of me.
please.
She wrote, having cancer hasn't been easy. As a person, I've changed a lot, and probably the most important lesson I've learned is just to focus and enjoy the present. Life is unpredictable for everyone with many unknowns, but there is a lot of beauty in everyday life. My goals going forward are to enjoy the present as much as possible and fight for better understanding and cures for this disease.
So exactly. And I think that we also are like, we're a family of high achievers who, you know, we do a lot, we push a lot, we're pushing boundaries, we're associated in, you know, again, in an intense world. And I think that there's that push as well to have a moment sometimes to reflect, to slow it down, to appreciate your family, to appreciate the friends, take the time off. And I always worry when I meet people who have, you know, a lifetime of wishes, like, oh, I wish I could go on this vacation, or I could do this, or I want to read these books, but they never find the time to do it. And I think that Susan actually always, I think, had a pretty balanced life. She always was remarkably good at work-life balance, of coming home for their kids. She always used to emphasize that to me, things like, don't do dinner meetings because like it takes away from your kids. It's not a good use of time. So she was always work-life balance. But I think, you know, she was surprised. She was surprised that she was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And I think that there was a lot of things still on her bucket list. And I think it's worth it for everybody to, you know, wake up and look outside and appreciate. Like, it's amazing to be alive. It's amazing to look around the world and the opportunities that we have, and to appreciate the small details every day. And I think Susan kind of had that mentality of, you know, let's have that moment of appreciation every day, even though it has really been an incredibly difficult time.
She wrote those words, but I do think that she had been living that. At her memorial, you know, her 9-year-old said, you know, my mom was, you know, a mom of 5 with a CEO side gig. Right. That's how her kids, right, saw her, that the YouTube CEO was kind of like the side, you know, the side activity.
Her side hustle.
Exactly. The extracurricular, right? So, you know, I think that she had been living that truth. It just became even more important to her, obviously, when we, you know, with the terminal diagnosis, and maybe also just to emphasize that to the world. But I guess for me, what's really important is we've seen the country come together in the past, like for coming together for COVID vaccination, right? To actually be able to design that in a year's time, you know, for HIV treatments. And I don't think there's any reason why, you know, we can't do the same for lung cancer, right? I think the only thing that's holding us back really is stigma. I think that there's a huge amount of stigma surrounding the disease. And I can't think any other reason why it's so underfunded.
And I think the lung cancer community is going to be so grateful for your work and your willingness to be allies for something that they've been dealing with for so long. Before we go, I had the privilege of talking briefly to Susan's husband, Dennis. And I know, gosh, you all have had a lot of tragedy in the last year or so, because I know your nephew, Marco, Susan's 19-year-old son, died of an accidental drug overdose just 6 months before Susan passed away. So now there are 4 kids, and I'm curious how Dennis and the children and your sweet mom, who was so proud of you. I met her once, and she just could not stop bragging about you girls in a very sweet way.
I'm sure.
But how are they doing, her kids? Because I know how hard that is. Although when my husband died, my girls were just 6 and 2. In a way, they were so young, they didn't really understand. But her kids are older, and I think it must be really, really tough.
Mhm.
And how
I
are
think
they?
I think similar, I mentioned my mom was a real doer. And my mom was very action oriented. And like, if there's a playground to be built, she's going to go and build it. Or if there's a project she wants to take on, she's going to solve it. And I think some of that actually came from my mom actually had her own tragedy when she was little, where her 18-month-old brother ate a bottle of aspirin and died. And they couldn't get the appropriate treatment for him. They couldn't, there was back in the day before you had laws about making sure that you could get into emergency rooms. They couldn't show proof of payment. There was all kinds of tragedy. And so my mom had that tragedy as a 5-year-old. And in her mind, she said very clearly, like, I have to focus forward. I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to get out. I'm going to get out of the situation, and I'm never going to let these types of things happen to me again. And I think for the kids, they have also had this mentality that we're going to make something of this tragedy. And so they actually started something called Marco's Mission, which is really focused on teaching kids about addiction and driving awareness. And I think especially in this culture now where there's a lot of legalization and there's all kinds of discussions around psychedelics, I think it's really important for kids to understand the risk benefits. And I think all of them now are looking at it and saying, Marco was, Marco was amazing kid, and full of potential, like a brilliant mathematician at Berkeley, and his life was taken too quickly. And they are going to make a difference with Marco's mission and drive that awareness and do something that is positive also in his honor. And so I do think that I'm appreciative of my mom. The Wojcicki mentality is very much about focus forward. Life is full of ups and downs. These are some like really awful, hits to the family, but we are going to turn that into something that is going to be a positive, and we're going to keep moving forward, and we'll live our lives in a way that make all of our ancestors and all of our family proud.
What do you all think Susan would want her legacy to be when all was said and done?
I mean, I think Susan was very proud of what she had done. She was very proud of what she had done at YouTube, in particular with regards to, dealing with hate speech, hands down. And she sacrificed on some level herself, right? She survived an attempt on her life at YouTube headquarters and had to have this kind of 24-hour security detail because of all the hate threats. So I think she felt very proud of actually, laying down structure at YouTube in terms of what kind of language is allowed and what kind of image, videos are allowed on the site. And then her family. So I think that as far as her legacy and, what she was worried about in terms of leaving too soon, it was all, of course, about, as a mom, about her kids and her husband, and making sure that they were going to do well, and, and that things would go on. I think that would be her, her one and only concern.
I echo what Janet said. I think her legacy a lot is like she was there on day one of like how the internet was built. And I think the structure and the foundation that she put in place, I think that she has a real place in history about how she managed everything. And then from that, there's the butterfly effect. And I think the butterfly effect of like all the people she influenced with how she trained them at YouTube or at Google, and the decisions she's made and the influence she made on all of the creators and how she treated people. And I think even as a working mom, and sort of that impact on normalizing breastfeeding and like working with your children. And I think that her ultimate joy was her children. And I think that she raised her children in such a way that they obviously they benefited from everything that she taught, at work, and the structure that she provided. And I think she believes in, her children and what they can do with their lives. And I think she is very proud of the legacy that she left. And I think that the world is in a better place because of her. And I think her children are a proud reminder of, everything she did and what was most important to her. And I think the community, the Google, YouTube community at large, is the biggest symbol of that butterfly effect and the way she treated all those people and how they are in turn going and treating others.
So they're paying it forward just like she did.
Exactly.